Amen. We are in Job chapter 1. We've looked at Job as a great individual. Job 1 and verse 1, described as a man who's blameless and upright, one who feared God and shunned evil. A man who was blessed to have a family and great wealth. Verse 2 and 3 of Job 1. He was a person that was not only morally upright, but he was religiously upright in that he sacrificed for his family, which indicates that this was a patriarch during that period of time before the giving of the law of Moses. We see verses 6 through 12 things that are behind the scene that could not be seen from an earthly standpoint. And we're going to see how that Satan here is saying the only reason why Job is serving God is because of why. He put a hedge around him. The hedge is referring to all the blessings that he has. All these blessings. So Satan is the accuser. He makes accusations. He brings accusations against people. And he's saying, yes, Job is serving you when all the sons of God are brought before and Satan is there. Yes, Job is serving you, but the reason why he's serving you is because he has all of these blessings. It says in verse 9, does Job serve you for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him and around his household and around all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. So here's a man that's been blessed by God. He's wealthy, prosperous because of God. And notice it was because of work, hard work. He did this by the works of his hand. This happened. And then Satan says in verse 11, but now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. Curse there means to dismiss. In the Hebrew, it means to bid farewell to God, to dismiss God, to renounce God, in other words. It is the opposite of blessing God. Blessing God is when we honor Him, respect Him, worship Him, and acknowledge Him. Cursing is the opposite of that, the very opposite. It means you're dismissing Him, you're rejecting Him, you're renouncing Him. And Satan is saying of Job, if you take away all of his blessings, he's going to renounce you. In fact, some translations might even say renounce. He will renounce you to your face. In other words, he won't serve you anymore. The reason why he serves you is because you've blessed him with so much. In verse 12, the Lord said to Satan, behold, all he has is in your power. Only do not lay a hand on his person. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Here we see that Satan is limited. We know this from various other passages, but Satan is limited in his power and what he can do. He only does what the Lord allows him to do. And that's why he is allowed to do this. And so the problems that Job is going to face come from Satan, but they are permitted by God. And sometimes people blame God for disaster, tragedy, heartache in their life. And it may be that God is allowing Satan to do what he's doing. It comes from Satan, but God is permitting it. This is what's known as his permissive will. He permits it to happen. It's not what God wants as far as his perfect will. It's what he allows to happen. That is what gives us the freedom to choose God or not. The freedom to obey him or disobey him. His permissive will. He permits us to have a choice. His perfect will says we are to obey him and be blessed. But his permissive will says, well, I'm going to give you a choice. And therefore Satan is allowed to do this. All that he has is in your hand, but do not lay a hand on his person. In other words, you don't touch him personally. You don't inflict him personally. But all of these blessings that he has, you're allowed to take away. Beginning in verse 13, you see the loss of his wealth and his children. Yes. It would keep, that would be a point in which Satan would not override us in the sense of making us do anything. We are limited, or Satan is limited in what he's able to do. In other words, he cannot overpower us. That's a good point. Satan can be bound. We know that from passages in the New Testament where Christ came to bind Satan, ultimately by his death on the cross. So verse 13 forward through the rest of the chapter, ending in verse 22, we're back on earth. Verses 6 through 12, we were in the spiritual realm. Now verses 13 through 22, we're back on earth. We're back on earth what we could see. Keep in mind, Job and all the people around him could not see what was going on in verses 6 through 12. They couldn't see the spiritual things that were going on. That's the realm beyond us. So they're trying to figure it out based upon what they see around them. Verse 13, now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, when the Sabaeans raided them and took them away. Indeed, they have killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I am alone have escaped to tell you. That's pretty bad. Verse 16. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Well, here's some more possessions gone. Verse 17, while he was still speaking, another also came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 bands, raided the camels, took them away, yes, and killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I am alone have escaped to tell you. Verse 18, while he was still speaking, another also came saying, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and suddenly a great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Now you think about that. One tragic news report after another. Boom, boom, boom. Hits him all at once. Culminating in the death of all of his kids. All of his children. Killed all at once. I mean, think about that happening to you. And you go back and you see what's happening here. Satan uses natural means to bring this about. There's nothing that seems miraculous about this. In fact, when it says the fire of God fell from heaven, that's the people's interpretation of what happened. Most likely that's talking about lightning. Most people have interpreted that as referring to lightning, and they're viewing that as the fire of God that came down and destroyed them. So they're explaining what they observed. And here, Satan is allowed to use natural disasters to bring about all this tragedy. Doesn't seem to be anything miraculous about it. And all of these natural disasters happening and bring all this tragedy upon Job, culminating with the death of his children. He went from one of the greatest men in that region, most wealthy, to dirt poor and childless one day. I mean, I can't even fathom that, to think of your children, all of your children, gone. I mean, one, but all of them. They're all gone. Some believe that this great wind that came in verse 19 could be referring to a tornado. Something of that nature that struck. And we know how in our side of the world here how tornadoes can strike and people's lives can be lost as a result of the great wind that destroys whole towns. Most people who would have heard that news, they would have turned to one thing. What would they have turned to? They would either turn to alcohol, that's one thing that they possibly would, but I'm thinking to suicide. They would have committed suicide. People have committed suicide for far less. For far less. And here he's lost everything financially, physically, and then his children on top of that. One thing you're going to see here, especially we'll see this when we get into chapter 3, Job laments the day he was born, but never ever is it anywhere indicated that he ever considered taking his own life. You don't see that with the godly men of the Bible. They lament the day they were born. They wish they hadn't been born. You see that with Jeremiah and other people. But they never, ever indicate they would take their own life. In fact, I believe it's even Jonah who said, Lord, take my life. Even Jonah, the prophet that wasn't that great a guy, he didn't consider killing himself. He wanted to be died. He wanted God to take his life. There is that concept there of you don't end your own life. No matter how bad things get, you don't end your own life. And we'll talk more about suicide when we get into chapter 3. And we can discuss that more in that chapter. But notice verses 20 through 22. How did he react? Now Satan is waiting for Job to curse God, to renounce God. Then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, fell to the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And in all this Job did not sin, nor charge God with wrong. Just an amazing thing here. That all of this bearing down upon Job, was he sorrowful? Yes. Verse 20 indicates that he tore his robe. That was an indication there of sorrow. That's what a person in the ancient world would do. And it's an expression of sorrow. You rip your robe. Shave his head. That indicates, again, mourning. They're in grief. They shave their head. Fall to the ground and worship God. He didn't fall to the ground and curse God. He fell to the ground and worshiped God. And he said, I came into this world with nothing, and I'm going to leave this world with nothing. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. This goes to show me, no matter what the devil throws at us, we don't have to sin. We don't have to sin. Satan here was trying to get Job to sin. And he was throwing everything at him, trying to get him to completely renounce God, and Job wouldn't do it. He turned to God in worship. How often do people face tragedy in their life, difficulty, heartache, problems, financial problems, the loss of a loved one, and in a tragic accident or tragic illness or sickness, and they completely stop going to worship? They don't worship God anymore. They completely forsake the Lord. And they blame God. They blame Him. Well, Job wasn't like that. Job said, I came into this world with nothing, and I shall return. out of this world with nothing. That's what that expression means there in verse 21. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. I'm going to leave this world with nothing. I came into the world. God blessed me with everything He wanted to bless me with, and then took it away from me. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin nor charge God with wrong. Your thoughts on this? How does this strike you?
He had great love and devotion to God.
Great love and devotion to God. He was a man that was, the word that comes to mind when I look at this is focused. So very focused on God, despite the sorrow and the pain he must have had in his heart from all the disaster that hit him. And he is just a man that's just going through more, and even more when we get in chapter 2, than I believe any man ever went through, quite possibly, except Christ. I think it's safe to say that Christ suffered the most of any human who's ever suffered on the face of the earth, because he was completely innocent. He never sinned. He never violated the will of God. He was bearing the sins of the world on him. But as far as other humans are concerned, this man probably is suffering more than anyone in human history. Anyone that has lost anything, you just multiply that with Job, with what he lost.
The other thing it shows is that Satan doesn't know Job's heart or his thoughts. He had to take a guess.
Right.
So, well, he has all this. This has to mean this, and so he's not able to read his heart or his mind or anything like that. He's just able to come in and say, "Well, let me wipe all this away and see what happens."
See what happens, right.
You know?
So Satan, in my way of looking at this, I surmise that he must have been as shocked about this as anyone else that he didn't sin, because he was expecting him to renounce God. He said earlier in chapter 1, you take it all away, he's going to renounce you. Well, the Lord said, do it. Take it all away. And he took it all away, and he didn't. He worshiped God. He worshiped Him.
Maybe he was a little bit shocked that he was wrong.
Right.
You know, he's like,
Yeah.
you know.
Satan is brilliant, but not all-knowing. And like I said, I think it was last week, this could be a lesson to Satan himself. You know, not only a lesson for us as we benefit from it in the Scriptures, but a lesson to Satan himself. That he can be resisted. Satan can be resisted. Well, chapter 2. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them and presented himself before the Lord. The word Lord there, Yahweh. And Yahweh said to Satan, from where do you come? So Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking back and forth on it. We are told, what is it, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 18, that the devil is like a lion walking about, seeking whom he may devour. Is that where I had it? Verse 8. 1 Peter 5, verse 8. He's a roaring lion seeking prey. And he thought he found prey in Job. He thought he could bring this prime example of a righteous man down. He thought if he could bring anyone down, he could bring Job down. It didn't happen with this. Verse 3. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? As one writer said, to be named a servant of God is one of the noblest titles any human could receive. A servant of God. And here you have God saying, "Have you considered my servant Job? That there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil. And still he holds fast his integrity, although you enticed me against him to destroy him without cause." Now there's a profound statement there. Verse 3, from the Lord, without cause. Sometimes there is a without cause behind the disaster. Now there's a reason for it for our betterment. There's a reason for it. But you start asking the question, why did this happen? Why did that happen? There's no cause for it to happen except God is proving a point with Job. And he says here, he still holds fast his integrity. And you held me out and enticed me against him to destroy him without cause. He allowed Satan to do that. Verse 4. So Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin. Yes, all that a man has he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand now and touch his bones and his flesh, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your hand, but spare his life." And again, in other words, this is all you can do. I'm going to let you do this much, but that's all you can do. Again, there's limitations on what Satan can do. So now Satan is allowed to inflict Job with a terrible disease, but not to take his life. The challenge is here, if you make Job as miserable as possible physically, on top of what everything else has happened, he's going to curse you. So he is in your hand. He's turning this over to Satan, but you spare his life. Verse 7. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took for himself a potsherd with which he scraped himself while he sat in the midst of the ashes. So here he is struck with a terrible disease. He's scraping himself with a piece of broken pottery. Now let's talk about this disease. It's not defined in Scripture, but we have some indications of what it might be. Some have suggested this possibly might be elephantitis, leprosy, or a leucoma of the skin. One of those three. And the reason why is because of the Scriptures we're going to look at. He had boils on his body, chapter 2 and verse 7. Those boils were itchy to the point where he had to scrape himself with a potsherd, chapter 2 and verse 8. His appearance was drastically different. Look at verse 12. When his friends came, when they raised their eyes from afar, they did not recognize him. And they lifted up their voices and wept. Each one tore his robe and sprinkled dust on his head toward heaven. So his friends came and they saw him. They didn't recognize him. He was so disfigured with this disease. So there's a drastic change in appearance. His skin had worms and running sores. Look at chapter 7 and verse 5. Chapter 7 and verse 5. Job says, "My flesh is caked with worms and dust. My skin is cracked and breaks out afresh." And he had corroding bones and gnawing pain. Look at chapter 30. Job chapter 30. And verse 17. "My bones are pierced in me at night, and my gnawing pains take no rest. And so he's hurting down to his bones with a gnawing pain. It's chronic pain is what we would call it today, medically. Chronic pain. It's not going away. He had blackened skin and had a fever, chapter 30 and verse 30. my skin grows black and falls from me. So it's coming off. And my bones burn with fever. Chapter 7 and verse 3 and chapter 29 and verse 2 indicates that this condition continued for months. Months as he is suffering. Because he talks about months in those passages. Chapter 7 and verse 3 and chapter 29 and verse 2. So whatever disease this is, it could have been a combination of several diseases. You can get hit with several diseases at once. It disfigured him. It caused boils to be on him. They were uncomfortable. They were itching, causing his skin to turn black, causing the skin to fall off, to have worms in it. He had running sores. His appearance was so bad that his friends saw him from a distance and they just cried out. They just mourned when they saw him. And so whatever hit him, he was miserable. Miserable. And so you have the emotional pain. Now you have physical pain on top of the emotional pain. So again, this seems to indicate this man is suffering beyond what anyone has normally suffered. And as a result of that, again, what would most people turn to? Suicide in your life. In fact, this is a kind of the suggestion his wife gives him. Not that he kill himself, but he renounce God. You curse God and die. Look at verse 9. Then his wife, chapter 2 and verse 9, then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. Now Mrs. Job, whoever she is, whatever her name is, she is saying, go ahead and do it. Curse God and die. Now some people have been really hard on her for saying that, but she might have, out of pity, seeing what her husband was going through, saying, get it over with. Now, of course, that's the wrong thing to do. She's giving wrong advice here. But she might have been hurting to see her husband go through this. And keep in mind, she would have been hurting too because of the loss of everything. You know, her children have died. So, I'm not too hard on Mrs. Job for saying this, but it's still the wrong thing. You don't do that. She's not focused like Job is. Not focused. So she is giving advice that the devil wants him to do. Now, she's in emotional distress, and so there's that factor that you have to put into the equation, but still wrong. It's still wrong. Curse God and die. Renounce God and die. And notice his reaction. But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God? And shall we not accept adversity? And in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. So again, he is rebuking his wife. Said, you're speaking as one of these foolish women. Someone who's speaking not as they ought. No matter what emotional thing might be behind it, it's still wrong to speak as she spoke. And he's saying here, shall we not accept good from the Lord and not adversity? You see, Job doesn't know that Satan is behind all of this. He's saying, he's focused on God, saying, God blessed me with all this. He took it away. Shall we not receive good from the Lord and adversity? So he took away my health. That was a blessing from God. Now he's taken away my health. He still sees that God is in control, and that's a good thing, but he's not seeing what we get to see because of the Scriptures revealing it to us, that Satan is behind it. And, we have to be careful how we comfort someone. And I got some good advice from a preacher one time. he was teaching this book of Job. He said, sometimes when we go and we try to comfort someone that's in very hard emotional distress, we mean well, but sometimes we say things that we just shouldn't say, like, if someone lost someone dear to them tragically in a car wreck, we go up and say, well, it's the Lord's will. We don't want to say that. We don't want to, because this person is thinking it was God's will that my child die painfully in this car wreck. We could turn people off of believing in God by making such statements, even though that's not what we mean to do. We're trying to search for words to comfort them and try to help them. And sometimes in doing that, we say the wrong things. And the thing that he suggested, as we're going to see with his friends here in verses 11 through 13, sometimes it's best not to say anything at all, just be there. Because when we try to get into the mode of explaining it, we don't know all the factors that are involved. We don't know that. And, we sometimes just being there for them, and it's just, we're going to see there that the friends came for 7 days. They were silent. They didn't say a word. Sometimes just being there for them is a good thing, without trying to feel that we need to explain what's going on, because some things are inexplicable. You can't explain it. And the more we try to explain it, the more we mess up. So it's better not to say anything. Just be there for them. Let them know, I'm here for you. I'm praying for you. That's some of the best things you could do. And then when we try to figure it out, try to explain it, it just gets worse sometimes. Did you have your hand up, Jenna?
I was just, what you said exactly, brought back a memory. When we had lost this full-term baby after Emily, the neighbor came over and said, well, it must have been God's will because he knew that he needed her. And I was just like, I knew she was speaking.
Right.
Figuratively, but still.
Right.
People try to explain it away, and it's just not possible. It doesn't do any good.
Right. It doesn't, and they mean well.
I know.
They mean well, but that's just something you just can't know, and to presume that we know the ins and out of providence and why things happen, why they didn't happen, we start speaking foolishly. We start, and especially if you'd have been weak in the faith, or someone that didn't have faith in God, that could have pushed you further away. Because there are a lot of people who are atheists because they resent some tragedy that happened in their life, and therefore they reject God.
And they don't use it to make them stronger. They turn to something that they need to know. They turn away from the
Right.
exact person that they most, which is God.
Right. And they'll find help in other places, and it's only temporary help. Like we studied Sunday night, you can find temporary help in certain things, but it's not the ultimate help that you need. So that's a good point. And so the three friends come, verses 11 through 13. And when Job's three friends heard of all his adversity, all this adversity that had come upon him, each one came from his own place. Eliphaz, the Temanite, Bildad, the Shuhite, Zophar, the Naamanite. For they had made an appointment together to come and mourn with him and to comfort him. So word gets out. This has happened to Job, and the reason why word would get out, of course, this would make the headline news, quote unquote, in the sense of this person, Job, was a great individual. He was a high-profile individual, and during that period of time, and then, boom, all this happened to him. So word's going to get out to people through messengers that this happened. So they come and they get together to mourn with him and to comfort him. They're his friends, but they keep silent. But then when they start opening their mouth, they start messing up because they start asking Job, "What'd you do? You must have really done something." So they were doing just fine until they started questioning Job. Verse 12, and when they raised their eyes from afar, they did not recognize him. They lifted up their voices and wept. Each one tore his robe, sprinkled dust on his head toward heaven. That would be an indication of mourning. You put dust on your head. The ripping of the clothes. They saw Job from afar, and he's not living in a normal place. He's living on the ash heap, in the midst of the ashes, there in verse 8. In other words, he's out. He's away from society. He's not in the comfort of some palace or the comfort of what he would have lived in as a wealthy patriarch. He's now probably away from everyone else for the reasons of his disease. Did they not do that with lepers? You'd have lepers put away. They had to live outside the camp. And if this disease was something that could be contagious, they would have said, Joe, you're going to have to live away from everyone else. So they go out to him, see him from afar, and they don't even recognize him. They don't not recognize him because of what is believed to be his deformities because of the disease. In verse 13, so they sat down with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his grief was very great. So they're camping out there where he is. But they're not saying anything to him for a period of about 7 days, because they see his grief is great. Now, we don't have a lot of time to go into chapter 3, but Job is going to break his silence here in chapter 3. And the way this is arranged in the book of Job with these speeches, a lot of times it's in Hebrew parallelism. What Hebrew parallelism is it would be stated one way, and in the next verse it would be stated in a slightly different way, but saying the same thing. He'd say one thing, and then the next sentence say the same thing, but slightly different. So they're parallel statements. They're saying the same thing, but simply different. Well, let's look at an example of that. In Job 3 and verse 1, after this, Job opened his mouth, cursed the day of his birth. Job spoke and said, may the day perish on which I was born, the night in which it was said, a male child is conceived. That's parallelism. He's saying the same thing in different words. The day perished that I was born, and the night in which it was said a male child was conceived. He's cursing the day of his birth using that type of poetry that you find a lot in the book of Psalms. You also see it in the book of Proverbs as well. It's found throughout the wisdom literature. Hebrew parallelism. Hebrew parallelism. Restating the same thing, slightly different. So he is cursing the day of his birth and cursing that a male child was conceived. That's saying the same thing, but just slightly different. And notice here, verse 3, conceived is considered the beginning point of life. This is consistent throughout Scripture. That conception is considered when human life begins. It goes all the way back to the time of Genesis. You look at Genesis chapter 4. Genesis 4 and verse 1. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. Conceived. And all throughout Scripture, when it talks about someone going to have a baby, conceived is the starting point. Conception. So the Bible is very clear. You're a human from conception on. So the embryo, the fetus, the whatever we call it, it's a human being. conception forward. That's why if you kill it, you terminate it, you abort it, you're killing a human being. That's why it's wrong. And if we can get people in our government to see that and really believe that, we will outlaw abortion once again as it should be outlawed. Because it's the killing of a human life. So he's bemoaning the day of his birth, the day he was conceived. Verse 4, it says in Job chapter 3 and verse 4, "May that day be darkness, may God above not seek it, nor the light shine upon it." I don't want any recognition of the day of my birth. "May darkness and the shadow of death claim it, may a cloud settle on it, may the blackness of the day terrify it." Here, he's using language to denote, I wish I'd never been born. Verse 6. "As for that night, may darkness seize it, may it not rejoice among the days of the year, may it not come into the number of the months. Oh, may that night be barren, may no joyful shout come into it. May those curse in whose curse the day, those who are ready to arouse Leviathan." Now, Leviathan is going to be a creature that he talks about a little bit later on in the book. Going to be talking about this creature that seems to be referring to a gigantic creature that we would call a dinosaur. We'll talk about Leviathan a little bit later on. It says in verse 9, "May the stars of its morning be dark, may it look for light but have none, and not see the dawning of the day, because it did not shut up the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide the sorrow from my eyes." Again, he's talking in this language, saying, I just wish I'd never been born. Verse 11, "Why did I not die at birth? Why did I not perish when I came from the womb?" He's wishing he had been stillborn and not survived. Again, verse 11 is indicating the point of there's life in the womb. That's human life in the womb. And so he's saying, I wish I had been stillborn. Verse 12, "Why did the knees receive me? Why were the breasts that I should nurse?" Verse 13, "For now I would have lain still and been quiet. I would have been asleep. Then I would have been at rest." Indicating death. Death being a condition of rest. And so he's indicating here that he'd never been conceived, never been born, and if he had been born, that he would have been a stillborn. Again, he's expressing his sorrow that he came into this world because of what he is facing and the pain and suffering of it, emotional, and on top of that, physical pain that he is going through. But again, in all of this, and we'll go through chapter 3 more next week, Lord willing, you see here, he wished he'd never been born, but he never said, I'm going to take my life. I'm going to take my life. The example of people in the Bible that took their life were wicked people who had turned away from God. Judas, King Saul, others you can find examples of. They were wicked people who turned away from God. Now, I will say this, and we could discuss this more next week, that I used to be of the persuasion that anyone that committed suicide, that they were committing self-murder, and therefore they couldn't be in a right standing with God. Having better understood that some people can get into a mental condition based upon brain damage or a chemical imbalance in their head. If they were a faithful Christian and they receive some sort of trauma to their head, they don't think straight anymore. Or they get into some chemical imbalance due to some medication. They don't think straight anymore. They're thinking crazy. And it's not because of anything they've done sinful. And they take their own life. They're not accountable for what they're doing. They're not accountable for their actions. So if they were in a saved condition and they found themselves in that condition of unaccountability due to injury, due to something that hit them, I'm not going to automatically think they're going to be lost because they took their own life. There are some circumstances, and God will judge them, God knows, in which there are some problems within the brain that cannot be helped, that would cause a person to end their own life. Now, God knows, and God sorts that out. But for other reasons, for someone to take their life just because they don't feel like they should be going on living, that's self-murder. That's wrong. That's always been wrong. And so, we should never in any way, shape, form, or fashion encourage anyone to do that. In fact, we should be in the business of helping people and talking people off the ledge, as it were, from making that tragic decision. All right. We'll continue this next week, Lord willing.